welcome to all of you, to the distinguished guests, Professor Dr. Adiba binti Kamaruzaman, also to our interim Pro-Vice Chancellor, Professor Matthew Nicholson, and to all academic staffs, ECRs, postdocs, everybody, welcome. Thank you for making it to the event today. Without further ado, I would like to just explain how this particular Mahaguru Supervisor series is going to work. So we'll actually begin with the opening speech by the President and Pro-Vice Chancellor, Professor Matthew Nicholson, and him launching this particular event. Then subsequently, we will also have Professor Adiba up to start the workshop. And the mode of this workshop today is she would be doing her presentation at the front, but the audiences, please feel free to raise up your hand if you would like to ask her a question, and then our staff from REU will be handing over the mic to you for you to raise your questions. So if all is well with everybody, I would like to invite Professor Matthew Nicholson to give his opening speech.
I saw in that I had 25 minutes, and I promise you there will, for those of you who were at my speech yesterday, and I took far too long, I apologise, but today will be a repeat of that. I would simply like to say that this is a very exciting day for the campus and for the REU, for this Maha Guru Supervision series. Really started when I had some conversations with colleagues in Australia and started to ask them about what mechanisms were in place to train and educate our supervisors. And I started to talk to them about, and I know that this is an often used and much used analogy of the canary in the mine shaft. And for those of you who know that, of the coal miners or the miners going into a mine and carrying the canary. For me, that canary in universities is the PhD student, that their experience really determines whether we have a healthy research culture or not. And central to their experience is their supervisor. And I'm sure almost all of us in the room have had a supervisor, had a PhD supervisor. Some of our experiences were very positive. Mine certainly was. A person who became a mentor, a friend, a great influence in my life. Some of us may have had slightly different experiences. We would have preferred a better relationship with our supervisor, but it's quite clear that at the heart of all universities is PhD students being the kind of the heartbeat and the engine room of our research activity, and their relationship with the university, their satisfaction, their research experience depends so much on their supervisor and their supervisor experience. So me being worried about this little canary in the mine shaft, or 600 little canaries, I started to have these conversations with Monash University Australia and our colleagues. And as many of you would know, because I've said this previously, the only requirement to be re-registered as a supervisor, and this is true of many universities around the world, that once you've supervised your first and you're registered, then you're essentially let go for, as I've, 25 years later, I've never done any additional formal training, I'm ashamed to say, as a supervisor. And what we wanted to do at Monash Malaysia was to create a professional development series that brought world-class supervisors to Monash Malaysia as part of a structured training and education opportunity for supervisors, so that as supervisors we can become reflective practitioners. As classroom educators, we are always encouraged through the SETU scores and other pieces of feedback to become reflective practitioners. As researchers, getting reviews from journals, we are essentially engaged constantly in a process of reflective practice through the view of feedback from reviewers, from our colleagues. And then as supervisors, yes, we're reflective constantly about the feedback we're getting from students, but very rarely do we get the opportunity to do these professional development activities. At the same time, as you would be aware, Monash is one of the many universities who collaborated on the Epigeum Supervisor training modules, 10 of those modules. And what we've done is to take 6 of those modules, and here I would like to particularly thank Shukri and Noor from the REU team, who put in an amazing amount of work to essentially take the Epigeum modules, choose the 6 most relevant, and then use those to scaffold the Maha supervision series. So, as I said, I'm very excited to be here today to launch the supervision series. It was Shukri and Noor's idea to use the term Maha Guru. Worldwide, lots of universities have master classes, which I think is particularly gendered, and we wanted to break free from that. And so the Monash University Malaysia Supervisor series is the Maha Guru series, and it's, as I say, very exciting and a very proud day for us to have this activity, this Supervisor series, which will run for the years ahead, offering 6 sessions per year with 6 world-class supervisors. So I did promise to be short. Without further ado, it is my pleasure to introduce our inaugural Maha Guru, and it is a great pleasure that we have Prof. Adiba to be our inaugural Maha Guru, which I think is very appropriate given that she did graduate from Monash University in 1987, received training in internal medicine and infectious diseases at the Monash Medical Centre, and then the Fairfield Infectious Diseases Hospital in Melbourne, which happens to be just quite nearby to my house in the city, Melbourne. Prof. Adiba is currently the Professor of Medicine and Infectious Diseases at University Malaya, and also an adjunct at Yale University. In the period of the COVID-19 pandemic, Prof. Adiba played a very important role on the Malaysian National Recovery Council, the chair of the UNMC COVID-19 Task Force, and a member of COVID-19 Task Force in a variety of states in the country. Prof. Adiba is highly regarded and recognised for her contribution as part of response to the HIV epidemic in Malaysia as well as globally, and she currently chairs the Malaysian AIDS Foundation and the International AIDS Society. In 2021, she was appointed a member of the WHO Science Council and is also contributing to the United Nations AIDS Advisory Group and the WHO Academy's Quality Committee. Her achievements, as you would expect, have been recognised through a variety of national and international awards, too numerous to mention here today. She's also been awarded an Honorary Doctor of Laws from Monash University for her exemplary contributions to the field of medicine and as a health advocate globally. So without further ado, it's my great pleasure to welcome Prof. Adiba as our inaugural Maha Guru.
Okay, Assalamualaikum and good afternoon, everyone. It's always good to be back at Monash, Malaysia. And thank you, Prof. Matthew, for that kind introduction. First disclosure, I myself never did a PhD, but went through the clinical infectious disease training, the FRSCP training, and I guess although different, that relationship between trainee and trainer is also important. And in fact, as part of my role at when we were reforming the specialist training program for Malaysia, are in the process of putting a more structured supervisor or trainee trainer framework, just like what you're doing here for PhD. What I said to Paul was, I think we'll try and make this, it is 4:00 in the afternoon, and I'm amazed that, there's this many people in the room. Let's try and make this as interactive as possible, because we want to get the most out of, I guess, collective experience of being a supervisor as well as a student. Those of you who've gone through your own journey of PhD must know that, like what Matthew said, it can be a very pleasant experience, or it can be hell, right, for both the supervisor and the student if there is no chemistry between the two of you. So, quite a bit of what what I'm saying here, I've taken from an Oxford sort of framework for their supervisors, the essentials of supervision that you can look up. So to start off with, it is really, really essential that the research topic that you are going to embark on, and together with the supervisor, you have a common interest or shared interest. I don't know what it's like at Monash, but at at one point, when there was this mad rush for KPIs and publications, it was like, sometimes the supervisors were often pressured to take students who may not have a common interest as you do. And you might have a peripheral interest in, I don't know, proteomics or something, but the core subject may not be something that you yourself have been working on. My advice is don't do it, because it is a long journey. It is a 4-year journey together, and if it's not something that you can't put your heart into it, then you're doing yourself and your student a disservice. So message number 1, make sure that it's a subject matter that you have some expertise in, and by that, I guess the common interest means you have some expertise in, because it truly it is a disservice to the student if you don't. And secondly, time. I'm really lying here a little bit. I supervise students, and I don't know how I do it because I don't have much time. But you make time, and so it's I guess it's important. Again, pressure from universities, pressure from students to take on more and more students. You've got to be true to yourself and to the students. Do you have time to supervise, particularly for students who maybe, there are some more mature students who come on and want to do a PhD. They might be able to work more independently, or those who've already had some work experience. But for those who are fresh out of university, or have only and have done masters and going straight to more research-based PhD, generally they tend to need more supervision. And also, I guess it also depends on the type of field work that's required. Lab-based supervision and field supervision almost always, need at least at the beginning a lot more hand-holding than some other types of supervision. At the outset, I think there needs to be a clear understanding of expectations, and I'll go into this in more detail later, what the research project is all about, deadlines, what are the outputs, meeting frequency, and like I said, we'll go through in detail in a short while. And I don't know whether we should move towards a written agreement between students and supervisors. Does Monash have one? Some universities, I think, have kind of a learning agreement. Similarly, sort of a supervisors. doesn't have one. We're moving towards that for the clinical master's training, sit down with them. These are the expectations. Do you agree, not agree? It's not an agreement in the sense that the student can take you to court, for instance, but it kind of sets out the expectations in writing, and that you have gone through this together and agree or disagree to the content of that note. So at the outset, I think it's important that both you and the student have a clear plan for their research project, and obviously they have to come to you with the research project, but that together you agree to a clear sense of direction, and that the supervisor will agree to supporting you in organizing, planning, and monitoring the project. And I think for those of you who are experienced supervisors, you'll know that that first iteration of the project often isn't the last. And I guess that's what research is all about, isn't it? You kind of adapt to the findings, adapt to the situation, and part of that initial discussion is to get students aware that they both of you and the student need to be flexible, and although that there needs to be a clear sense of direction, but at the same time be flexible to within the research ideas and aims and objectives. Like I said, it has to be a research topic that interests you both. It is tough if you only have a peripheral interest on it, because you're not going to put your heart and soul into the supervision, and the student's not going to benefit from that. Again, at the outset, think realistically about the practical implications of the choice, the time required, necessary traveling, fieldwork, access to equipment, possible cost, and so forth. Sometimes the more inexperienced students want to cover the whole, the stars and the moons and everything in their research, and it's your role to kind of pull back and say, wait a minute, you're not going to cover all those things. It's better to go more in depth than superficially and try and do too many experiments or too many questionnaires and of topics. So I think this is what we need to convey to the students, that once they've defined the topic, it is then important to turn it into something that's more focused. Like I said, often students, want to do something that's really big and broad, and it is our role to guide them to be more focused, and particularly time is of the essence. I guess Monash is also under the same pressure for this whole graduate on time that KPT puts on us, which can be completely unrealistic. 3.5 years for a PhD. It's a struggle for medicine. I think for computer science, engineering, they always say, oh, what's the problem with that? I used to fight with the other deans about this, and they were like, 3.5 years, easy. And I was like, well, in medicine, we're just defining the population in the first year and where to go and all of that. So hence, with that kind of pressure put on on the students and on us by KPT and others. It is super important that we guide the students to be realistic about their project, because often we they get excited and want to cover lots of topics. Feel free to stop me anytime you want. Again, these are the things that we need to discuss with the students, the types, the methods of, obviously this is the crux of doing research, isn't it? What kind of methods, and through that, I think through this important initial discussion, you will guide them to all the essentials of doing research. In the case of human research, obviously, the sometimes arduous ethics applications that can take a long time and may delay the process of doing research. This often is a major stumbling block for medical research in this country, and we need to make our candidates aware of that right from the outset. So again, they don't have unrealistic expectations of their own research. So for example, I myself have been caught a few times doing this. I've been doing quite a bit of research in Kajang prison, of all places, a prison that's been made famous in the last 24 hours. And we've been doing research there for a long time, and we have been getting Yale IRB, because some of the funding's from the US, and we've been getting IRB approval from UMMC. And suddenly, for the second grant that we applied, prisons department, although we have a very good working relationship with them, said, "Oh, I think you need to apply to the Ministry of Health as well for approval." And to which we all thought, "Oh my God!" and because they said the prisons department can't, the health for prisoners comes under the jurisdiction of Ministry of Health. The Ministry of Health has this blanket rule that anything you do with either staff, patients, or facilities of the Ministry of Health, you will need to get IRB approval from them. So that kind of delayed our research by a good 3 to 4 months. So again, these are the sort of things you need to flag very, very early on with candidates, because what it means is they would need to put in 2 or 3 ethics applications to different IRB boards. That can take time. The other is, of course, right from the beginning, identifying some of the skills that they need. Many of our candidates, many of the medical the research PhD students that I've supervised, come from classic medical training and have had some basic statistics training, but not have had qualitative training for which can be a crucial piece of their research. So by identifying those sorts of gaps within their own research skills early, you can then help them plan what other skills may be required for them to move forward. And so here it is in terms of analytical skills and even writing skills. I think again, many of our candidates may not be so fluent or may not be very familiar with scientific writing, and it's something that we need to guide them through. One of the things we're doing at the moment, for example, I was just talking to Mark Cheong about the Masters in Research Ethics that we have at UM, that we're working with Hopkins, and that again, if someone wants to do a PhD in research ethics, the style of writing is completely different, once again, to the style of writing for a straightforward clinical research paper. So identifying those differences together, and what skills they may need, what further training they require on top of the standard practice to conduct the research is going to be important. And the reason for that is, of course, it also adds time in terms of the conduct of research. It may slow the conduct of research, and cost. And these are some of the questions that we need to kind of talk through with them. What are the skills building that's required, and sort of practically sitting down with them right at the beginning, of course, throughout the supervision, to identify some of these practical hurdles that they are going to face. And then this is at the outset, produce a draft timetable, which inevitably gets changed throughout, and also remind them to include any possible delays that may happen. One of the most stressful is, I think, for a supervisor, and I think all of you who have supervised PhD students, is the cost of doing research, right? Some students come to you already with a research grant. More often than not, we go out and look for students when we have a research grant, and work together with them for them to take on the grant that you've managed to get. At other times, they it's a continuation of their master's program and want to expand on that, and you have to go out looking for funding. This is I think singularly probably the most stressful thing as a supervisor, because research funding in this country is not exactly readily available, and oftentimes the students suddenly find themselves halfway through and are not able to complete because funding has dried up, and so forth. So once again, it's really, really important to, right at the outset, kind of have some idea of what this whole endeavor is going to cost. The worst thing to happen is, like halfway through or 3/4 of the way through, and you find that funding has dried up, and the students left in the lurch. I think this has happened all too often, unfortunately, and it's really unfortunate. So as a supervisor, I think we have a huge obligation to ensure that there's enough funding to complete the research project, and because otherwise, they've already invested so much time, so much effort. It's really not good. Obviously, as part of the initial encounter, we've really identified some of the risks, like what I went through before, but also important to together with the candidate try and tease out what potential risks and limitations there might be, whether it's IRB or not enough sample size because of XYZ, and so forth. And we already talked about training and professional development. Publications, I've got it out there because this, I think, in the academic world is the kind of thing that break friendships and and, right? So be very, very clear, and especially, well, I don't think it's just here in Malaysia. I think it's everywhere. You know, you've heard the term, it's a dog eat dog world, right? So it, you know, there is sometimes, not sometimes, you know, you've heard of supervisors. You see it on Twitter, people saying my supervisor has just, you know, claimed that this publication, this research is his, and he's the first author and so forth. Well, I did all the work. So that kind of stuff is all too common, and it's unfortunate. So I think, again, in that early stage setting with the student, it's very important that you make all this very clear. Obviously, I think the student who's done all the work should be the first author, and you as a supervisor should be the last author, or if in the early stages of publications, perhaps you can be the corresponding author. But as they mature through and you know, publish, they should be the first and the corresponding author. But this is the stuff that is really demoralizing for the students when you claim to be the first author and they've done all the work. But this is just all too common in academia. I can see Matthew nodding vigorously, and it's really quite unfortunate. If you are part of a team, if you are supervising as more than one person, be sure to engage your co-supervisor in this discussion, because again, you know, it can lead to breakups of friendships, and when it gets really ugly, it goes all the way up to, you know, the deans and the administrators and so forth. So I think getting very clear agreements on authorship, not just between you and the student, but between you and your co-supervisors, is super, super important, because as dean, I had to act as what's it called, like an umpire in many of these disagreements as to who did what and who should be who should appear first, and so forth. Again, because of this obsession with KPIs and so forth, it just makes matters worse in our environment. We also need to spend time with them, talking through when they're ready to write up. Like I said, many students struggle through this, at least here in Malaysia, because of the language issues, and so, you know, drafts after drafts, I don't know, some supervisors, and I was watching this again when I was dean. Some supervisors, the really diligent ones, will go through, you know, word by word, and will correct grammar and spelling and so forth, whereas others will just look through, you know, make sure that the science is correct. Of course, I think you need to, if the students are not fluent, think about engaging, you know, someone who can, if you don't have the time, someone to help them with the language side of things. But I think as a supervisor, I don't know about the rest of you, I tend to look through the grammar and the spelling myself as well, because in the end, you know, it kind of reflects really badly on you if you have a very slipshod, very badly written thesis, in terms of, forget about the science, but even if the grammar is not good, because it can be very distracting to the examiners if you know, the sentence construct and all that's not, and the students will not be able to convey their message as well as they could if it's well written. So my advice would be to spend some time to look at the not just at the content from a scientific validity and all of that, but also assist the students with the language part of it. Like I say, if nothing else, it reflects quite badly on you, and it's a badly written thesis. So I think this is my last slide. Basically, right from the outset, agree on a timetable of meetings. It really depends on your own personal style, I think. I think in the early stages, it behooves to meet frequently, even if it's just for half an hour. But, to meet frequently and to iron out and any kinks. And the worst thing is to let them kind of percolate, go through, and before you know it, there's a disaster on the horizon. If you meet frequently, then you're able to troubleshoot quickly as well. So focus for supervision, so make use of best of time. Identifying what you can send to this slide's been made as if I'm talking to students, but I'm talking to you all, and encourage your candidates to set an agenda before the meeting. It could just be a one-item agenda to discuss IRB application, for example, but I think it would be more efficient to meet in short bursts, but frequently, like I said, to troubleshoot and overcome any problems before they become a major problem. And lastly, keep a record of the discussion. So I think, like I said, that's my last slide. Personally, I've supervised both masters in research and PhD students. I've got a few PhD students that I'm supervising at the moment. Do I use those tricks? Yeah, I think with COVID, we've all learned to do quick Zoom meetings now, and scheduling those meetings on Zoom on a weekly basis or 2 weekly or whatever, depending on the stage of their project. I find it's a lot better, like I said, than to find out like 2 months, 3 months later that they're struggling. So I guess my take-home message as supervisors, 3 things. One is, choose a student and the topic that you are comfortable with, and you know something about, and so that you can supervise to the best of your ability. And secondly, have these regular sit downs with the candidates so that you can troubleshoot early. And number 3, enjoy the journey. It's not always easy, but it's really when you see your students graduate and then become experts in the field, it's nothing more fulfilling for us as teachers and academics than that. So thank you very much.
We would like to have Prof. Adiba to remain on stage, and now I think we will open up questions to the floor. Are there any questions that you'd like to ask?
Right, thank you very much for the talk, Prof. Adiba. So You mentioned about supervisory style and ensuring that there's chemistry between the supervisor and supervisee. So in my experience, I was fortunate enough to have a supervisor who adopted a very hands-off approach, which matched my personality, and we got on very fine. And having inherited that approach, I find that it doesn't work for some of the students in which I supervise. So the question really is, in your experience, should a supervisor change their methods depending on the supervisee that they decide to take on, or should they really just take on supervisees that match their own general nature and personality?
Good question, Mark. But often you may not realize it until a little later. You've already signed them on, you've already said yes, and then realize that they need a lot more hand holding than you thought they did, or conversely, they prefer to work much more independently. And I think this is perhaps something that needs to be laid out there early. You tell them, I'm a more a hands off, but my door is always open. My email is on 24 hours, and I think being open and transparent about it is important. Again, about setting expectations. Yeah.
Thank you, Prof. I would like to ask about publications. Actually, in Monash, Malaysia, also I have seen few papers where there is a conflict of who will be the first author, and many times supervisor want to be the first author. And if you see, actually, all the work is done by student, and ethically speaking, it should be the student who is doing the hard work and should be the first author. So what do you think of this whenever we come to this conflict, who will be the first author?
Yeah, which is, like I said, it's not an uncommon conflict. I think the first thing is to turn into the international standards, like the ICJME in terms of medical publications, which clearly sets out, like who deserves the first authorship and so forth and so forth. And you can go to the supervisor and say, I think you're being unfair. These are the criteria for authorships, whether first or corresponding or second or whatever. That would be my approach. For the recalcitrant supervisors, call the dean. That's their job. What's my job? No longer. Yeah.
Hi, Prof. Adiba. Following up to that question, so could you share with us if you have any past experience like the problem like this escalated to the dean? Because it happened to me sort of something like a dispute between the supervisor and supervisee during my master's. So I was told that as a dean or head of school, it's always better to sacrifice the student to not offend your colleagues. Yeah, so could you share with us your experience?
Do you sacrifice
thanks.
the students or do you sacrifice it? No, I don't think you want to get to that stage of sacrificing one or the other, but I think it's really, really important that you have a discussion with the supervisor, because this bad behavior cannot be condoned, and if you sacrifice the students, they're only going to get emboldened and doing it to the next and the next. And, word will get out that he's a mean supervisor, or he steals other people's work, and people are not going to come. So, bad karma gets back to you, as you know.
Sorry, if I can comment on Nafi's question just now. If I were the supervisor, first author and last author, I would prefer to be the last author, because for promotion, for top research scientists in Malaysia, blah blah blah, it's they're looking for the last author and the corresponding author. So why compete with the student to be the first author?
Agree, but I think different disciplines, different fields look at these authorships differently. The sequence, and like I said, there are international standards that people have done the thinking for us to for us to go by, you know, and it may be different for medicine compared to engineering, compared to computer science. So, but I believe each discipline have worked this out, whether it's first and the social sciences, you know. I think for the social sciences, last authorship is more important than first authorship. So, yeah, I think if you fall back onto international standards, then it's a bit harder for people to argue.
Normally, the first author is the person who does most of the student.
Yeah, so it really is quite clearly spelled out in different sort of standards governing these things.
I have another question. How do you address a sleeping partner or
A co-supervisor.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So when the grants are not together, but the individual didn't really help much, but insists on getting his or her name on all of the application or outputs.
This is also like common, right? Again, talking to them, and again, bad behavior shouldn't be rewarded. Okay, you can get on this paper, but it'll soon become obvious to others, and people won't invite them to collaborate anymore.
I'd like to ask a question, but before I do, I might just comment that as an Australian university, we have the NHMRC guidelines and close them up. We have the NHMRC guidelines, and some of those questions that have been asked in the back of the room about authorship are really clearly defined in the NHMRC guidelines. So if you haven't read them, I would encourage you to do so as a staff member at an Australian university. And to Garn's question about the sleeping partner, the NHMRC guidelines are very clear. Being on a funding application does not warrant authorship of an article that comes out of that funding. You must have some action, some meaningful contribution to the research. Being on the funding application is not sufficient. So, like you said, we have some guidelines. I'd like to take you back to the start where you talked about the student who wants to research the moon and the stars, and how as a supervisor you balance, and how you recommend supervisors in this audience balance the student in today's academic world wanting to be so ambitious that they're going to make a name for themselves, they're going to be employed, they're going to get postdoc and other opportunities, but at the same time choosing something that's reasonable, achievable, and is within the time frame. How you balance that?
Yeah.
It's not easy to balance that, but I think I guess it's part of our role, isn't it, to make them see that quality is going to get them noticed more than sort of general superficial piece of work, and they can always add on to that. If they do quality work and publish, they will get noticed, and they can always extend that work later on, either in their postdoc or through their career, so they don't have to put everything in the 4 years, least of all because funding may not allow it.
Thank you very much for sharing your tips about how to set expectations. Now, my question to you is, how frequently do you have to review the expectations together with your student, or do you think it's going to be necessary along the journey of PhD? Because sometimes, as you've mentioned earlier, things sort of changes throughout the course of the journey? And does that actually warrant you to review that along the way? And if yes, maybe how frequently do you think that should be?
Yeah, so I think it also depends on the nature of research. The candidate I'm supervising at the moment, she's doing sort of an looking at HIV stigma intervention in clinics in Indonesia, using an implementation science framework. The research didn't begin like that. Initially, she was going to do when she signed up, when she first started discussing with me. It was going to be around HIV stigma. It was going to be in Malaysia, and it was going to be qualitative and quantitative survey for amongst Malaysian practitioners. And then we have this Fogarty training grant that enabled me to send her over to Yale and to do more implementation science training. She came back and had this idea, because she had worked in Indonesia before, to then change almost the whole PhD, but within that same framework. So clearly that was a big shift, and it's going to increase the funding requirements and so forth and so forth. So I think it depends on the scope of the change. With that, I had to sit with her quite frequently to navigate all these changes. But I personally think it would make for a much stronger PhD and valuable PhD. But it also meant more commitment on my side because of that. So it really depends on how much change you're making. And that's why I think having these regular meetings will enable you to recognize, where you need to pivot and what needs to be done before letting it go for even a month or 2 months, and then suddenly you find that things have gone out of hand.
Thank you very much. Are there further questions from the floor?
Hello, Prof. Thanks very much for the answering the question and being here to share with us your experience. My name is Woon from Pharmacy. I have a questions related to, I think it's the quantity versus the quality of the research, because the title of your presentation is related to the Maha group, as a supervisors. Sometimes, as an academician, we are governed by the schools and faculty and university directions. Of course, that would set an expectation of certain quantity of the output that we might have to produce. And yeah, and apparently the entire environment seems to be steering towards the directions that the numbers count. But that number doesn't really mean a particular supervisor is any less inferior compared to the others. So I guess my question is, for you, would you encourage the student to follow, to publish as much as possible, or don't follow the trend? Do what is right that you think?
This is a real policy struggle, My heart tells me don't follow, because I'm a bit of a rebel. But you'll get Matthew into trouble. You'll get your dean into trouble. There's no easy answer to this. I thought, for instance, at I thought we had kind of come to agreement, particularly for my clinical colleagues, that the KPI doesn't just go by the numbers and other things, promotions and other things. It's not just publications, number of publications take into account. but it's a hard struggle, and I must say I don't have an easy answer. 10 years of dean, it was the bane of my life. Let me be honest with you with this trying to keep up with this demand for publications in KPI. The other thing that I honestly think, does Monash have this, that students have to publish whilst doing their PhD or they won't graduate? So has that, and again, it's a real struggle for both supervisors and supervisee to do their research, publish, and put the theses together. So we kind of tried to kill two birds with one stone, if you like, and allow, I think Monash does as well, right? Publication by a PhD by publication. So, but not all disciplines necessarily kind of not amenable is not the word for it, but you know that like for medical PhDs that's quite possible. You do your meta-analysis or lit review, systematic review as part of your lit review, get a paper of that, and then sometimes you can, if you're doing complicated methods, you can get another paper out of that, and so forth and so forth. But not all PhD projects lend itself to that kind of writing as well. Yeah, I think collectively university leadership needs to continue to impress on KPT that it's not just all about numbers. I know, I think they know this, but it's a really tough balance for them to, then they go back and then they turn around and say, so how do you measure quality?
Thanks, Dr. Adiba, for the talk. Can I ask, perhaps, could you advise on what's the best approach to selection of a suitable candidate for postgraduate studies in your experience?
Yeah, that's not easy. Like I said, sometimes students come to you, and other times you go out, and when you have a big research grant, you go out and look for a student, advertise for a student, and so forth. Or some have been with you as research assistants, and then did a master's with you and PhD. I think those are the best because you kind of have nurtured them and get to know them. They know your style and so forth. But if it's fresh from an application, or you've got a grant and you're putting out a search for one, there's no magic answer to this. I tend to shy away a little bit from the ones that come to you and say, hey, can you be my supervisor? A, because I don't have time, but B, because you really don't know the working style. I guess it goes back to, do your interests match, first of all, and then you look at their background, what skills they have, what lab if it's a lab research, what lab experience, what again goes back to the skills, have they written anything that you can have a look at, and so forth.
Thank you so much, Prof. Adiba. I'm Sen from School of Medicine. Many times we wonder that sometimes when we are in difficult circumstances, especially with relationship with supervisees, we tend to fall back onto our peers in that sense sometimes. So the peers was good in our own research group, but maybe outside the research group there could be a well experienced supervisor who may have handled such situations earlier. So what's your take on to a little bit of peer support, especially for those young supervisors in that sense in the initial stage?
I think, to have a group of supervisors can be good, especially if one is more junior and less experienced, but it can also be more headaches sometimes, particularly when it comes to division of labor and publication and truly supervising or not. In the end, I think what it always boils down to is communication. Being transparent, communicating, often can overcome many of the challenges and barriers that we face.
Any further questions from the floor? Mark?
Sorry, I'm a glutton for this. But increasingly, I think supervisors find that there is a lot of emphasis on ensuring the supervisees' welfare, mental health, so on and so forth. And naturally, we find that a lot of the problems that students face with these tend to stem from perhaps personal crises, issues in their personal lives. What do you think is the right line to cross or not to cross for a supervisor who's perhaps managing a supervisee who's now having their progress threatened because of issues in their personal life? Do you think it's fair for supervisors to have to care so much more about their supervisees' personal life and issues, and how should we best support them through these things?
Yeah, tough question, Mark. What does the NHMRC say about this? Do your best. Yeah, I think as a supervisor, you do have some obligation, obviously, to ensure that to help them through the crises, and at the very least point them to the right experts, or the right resources that can help them. But yeah, you also need to be careful that you don't get embroiled in kind of all these personal crises as well, and worse, get in between, sort of domestic conflicts and things like that. So it is a difficult and a fine line to tread. If you yourself are struggling, to escalate up, and if you're not sure, or if you're starting to feel uncomfortable. But I think, like Matthew said, do your best, but within certain boundaries, and at the very least point them to the right resources and support that they may get. Perhaps my medical training has kind of given me some thick skin to otherwise you get so I think we all develop this kind of wall between ourselves and our patients. Not all. A lot of my colleagues get very, very involved. I don't usually give my telephone number to my patients. My students I do, but my patients I tend not to, except for very, very select few. But there are lots of people who very easily give their phone numbers to their patients. If nothing else, you yourself need time out and so that you don't burn out. So yeah, occasionally I feel bad for having this wall with my patients and their relatives, but it's also necessary because we're in it for the long haul, right? So if you start getting embroiled in all of your students' personal problems, it can get exhausting and unnecessarily so. Yeah.
It looks like my colleagues have a lot of supervision related questions, means they have a lot of students. Me being on the other side of the spectrum as a ECR, struggling to get students and sometimes struggling to get grants. You get a grant, but you can't find a student, or you find a student, but you don't have a grant. So I was just discussing with my colleague, this is a chicken and an egg problem, so maybe you can help us settle it. Which one should we go for first? Get a student, then look for a grant, or get a grant, then look for a student?
get a grant, look for a student, because if you have a student and you don't have the grant to do the research, then you both of you are stuck. Yeah, unless you have a superstar student, and then you can somehow talk to Monash to give you some seed funding.
Prof, just hopefully last question of last line of your last slide about keeping record of discussion between supervisee and supervisor. Actually, when we try to keep a record in each meeting, it gives more sort of like security to the supervisor. But students think that it is like sort of insecure or whatever we are discussing, and it gives some sort of like restriction student can think of in terms of innovation or in terms of trying new idea in his or her research. So my question is, up to what extent we can go in this regard?
What I normally tell them is just email me back what we've discussed, like a minute of our discussion. It's important for me so that I remember what I just said half an hour ago. And for them as well. So it's nothing fancy. It's if the agenda for the day was on IRB applications, just email me back what did we discuss. When are you submitting the application? When's the due date? What are the other outstanding things that need to be done? Those kinds of record, so that when you then meet them next time, it's just like having a board meeting, I guess. What was the agenda? What did we discuss with the minutes? What are the outstanding items that we need to go through before we move on to today's discussion, kind of thing. Nothing fancy. It could just be 10 bullet points or something like that.
Right. Hi, Prof. Just to ask if you've had an experience or something similar or advice where there's a student who thinks that their work is up to a certain level of quality, but you as a supervisor know that it is not up to par. Would you rather bite the bullet and wait until it's a certain examination period and let the examiners handle it? Or if it's a certain duration away, do you cut your losses and then just say that that's it? So where do you draw the line of how much your responsibility
I guess
you
that's
have?
your role as supervisor to say this is not good enough. You need to go and do more lab work or enroll more participants into the study or whatever. But yeah, because again, if you let it go to the examination to have the external examiners point that out to you, it doesn't reflect well on you.
Sure. But I mean, have you had experience where the student just refuses to listen? Because this was from a very recent experience where for a couple of consecutive months, they just assume that their work is up to par, but they just refuse to listen to the supervision agreement. So where do you draw the line and say, I do not want to supervise anymore since the student is not responding to any of the actual supervision advice? So what is the point of supervising in the first place? Do you actually cut your losses, or do you just...
we as dean, I had to adjudicate in these kinds of things. Escalate it to the deputy dean. What my colleagues at the faculty used to do, escalate it to deputy dean of research, get a third party to talk to the student and say, your supervisor is thinks that you need to do more work, and if they still don't want to follow, then yeah, cut your losses.
Thank you.
So with a couple of those points in mind, let me return you to what was on your first slide, which was with a question mark about the written agreement and how much of some of these issues that have been raised could be solved by a written agreement, and what would that look like?
Again, we don't have one, and it was something I came across when reading about this from at Oxford, and I think they don't have one either, but are contemplating it. I suppose some of the easy ones would be around publications and due dates, and with some leeway, kind of thing, but I don't know if I myself am ready to go towards a written agreement. Yeah. What about you?
Because we're always faced, I think, as supervisors with this grey area of it's a social contract that we've entered into. But then 2, 3, 4, and for me, unfortunately, with 2 students, 2 10-year supervisions, almost embarrassed to say, that relationship changes over time, and the expectations that you were setting in that initial 6 months to a year have now, as you've said, completely evaporated. And so you wonder how much utility the written agreement has at the start. Like any contract, it's able to be broken, right? And so to Poe's point, that kind of regular check-in, reassess, are we doing it right? How could we do it better? And your point was communication lies at the heart of all of this. And I think some of the questions we've heard today, it's not easy. I'm absolutely not saying it's easy, but a written agreement, I think I'm with you. I think it would be very hard to institute, and people would really grate against that, almost rail against that, I think.
Okay, good evening, Prof. So earlier on, you did mention that it's important to have a clear direction from the start of supervision. So along the way, let's say there is possibilities for change of this direction due to maybe an examiner's comment or a co-supervisor's comment, and it's not agreeable with the student, for example. So there is a possibility of having conflict between the supervisor and the students. So how do we handle this kind of conflict when we have already agreed at the starting stage to do certain work, and then later on we may need to change the direction due to suggestion from examiner or co-supervisors?
I think it also depends on the stage of research, obviously, isn't it? It would be most unfair to the student if they're 3/4 of the way through and you have this bright idea and you want to change direction. So again, by having frequent meetings to troubleshoot these things, then and also you then develop a rapport with the students, and they, if you are suggesting to them to change directions at an earlier stage, that might be a bit more palatable than they've already done X, Y, Z, and then you want to change directions.
So, for example, if it's the examiner's comment, normally it will be after the milestone presentation and things like that. So, possibly it could be midway. So, what if it's not at the beginning stage? It's after midway or maybe 3/4.
Then I think you as a supervisor need to assess the comments from the examiner. Not all examiners' comments are to be taken on board, right? They may not, they may not have the whole picture, and it's our duty to assess how much of that is relevant, how much of that will strengthen the research, how much of that can be incorporated at a later stage.
Okay, thanks, Prof. Okay.
I think just now in your talk, you actually mentioned about ethical clearance taking up a lot of time. Sometimes unexpectedly, it might drag on for many months. So how do you then manage the expectations of those students thinking that it might be finished very quickly, and also mentally, how do you actually manage them mentally so that you don't get stressed out about it?
What I often tell them to do is to start writing what they can write already, like the introduction, the literature review, and all that. Because again, writing often takes many drafts, right? So whilst waiting, if you can do all those things, at least you get those out of the way whilst waiting for all this ethics approval and other things.
I mean, as a supervisor, I think we are able to be as proactive as possible. But if you're faced with this situation where your student is actually pretty passive, how do you actually get that motivation out from them so that, I mean, because sometimes it takes both hands to clap. So if we are just being like one-sided or very motivated, and then we are like, oh. So is there any tip or tips that you can actually share with the audience as to how we deal with this sort of situation?
No. Then maybe I think then you try once, you try twice, and if they're really not responding, then a good sit down and asking them, do you really want to do this? Might be in order, because it is a huge commitment, right? And if they're half-hearted about it, then they might as well be honest with themselves.
Thank you very much. Are there further questions from the floor? Are you all happy with all the answers that Prof and also our experience that Prof Adiba has actually shared with us? All right, so then we give a big hand to Prof Adiba. Thank you very much for sharing your experience. Now, may I please invite you to stay on stage, and also Prof Matthew to be on stage. We would like to take this opportunity to present Prof Adiba a token of appreciation for her time spent today. Thank you very much. Before we leave this session, I would like to take this opportunity to promote the upcoming sessions, and also to get your feedback for this particular session on how we can improve this further. And we also would like to take this opportunity to do a group photo with everyone. So if you could please move nearer to the center so that the cameraman can actually take a good photo of every one of us. Yeah.